Hello and welcome. Thanks for taking time to join us for another installment of Slow Art presented by the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth. And in this installment, we will look at an untitled work by Judd, completed in 1967. Now, this work is one of the many stacks completed by Judd throughout his career. The various stacks were similar in basic form, but by using varying materials, colors, and combinations of material and color placement, Judd could change the whole effect of each work. When experiencing a stack for the first time, the viewer is often drawn to each individual box element, followed by being drawn to the entire stack. As Francis Colpett, professor of art history at Texas Christian University, states in the museum's catalog, each box element is humanly graspable, while the work as a whole towers above the visitor. Now, typically knowing more about a modern artist is helpful in better understanding the art that they've created. In the case of Judd, it seems more like a requirement. Judd was a well-educated philosopher, artist, art critic, and museum creator who was also very keen on measurements and numbering systems when creating his work. So understanding a bit about his art philosophy and experience helps to better appreciate his work, including this stack. Judd was born in Excelsior Springs, Missouri, June 3rd, 1928. And we'll pick up when he joined the Army in 1946 and was stationed as an engineer in Korea until 1947. While traveling from the East Coast to California to ship out to Korea, Judd traveled by train and passed through a small West Texas town called Marfa. After his trip, he wrote his mother that he thought Marfa was a fantastic place and he would like to return someday. Judd kept his promise and returned to Marfa in 1971, returning full-time in 1979. With the help of the Dia Art Foundation, Judd started a development of an art installation on the site of Fort D.A. Russell, an abandoned Army cavalry installation in Marfa. Now, Dia ran into financial troubles in the 1980s, and the facility, with the improvements, was transferred to a foundation established by Judd, which was later named the Shinati Foundation, after the Shinati Mountains near Marfa. Now, while in Korea, Judd's work as an engineer developed into an interest in architecture, which would prove influential in later years. He also picked up a book on Russian history from a pile of books provided by the Army for the troops. This led to an interest in Russian history and subsequently Russian art. And we'll revisit this Russian interest in just a bit. After returning from Korea, and once out of the Army, Judd enrolled briefly at the College of William and Mary, later transferring to Columbia University, where he earned a bachelor's degree in philosophy. He then studied postgraduate art history, also at Columbia. Finally, he studied painting at the Art Students League. Now, this combination of his education in philosophy and art history led to his ability to write critical reviews of art theory and practice. He worked professionally as an art critic from 1959 to 1965, writing dozens of reviews. The Judd Foundation has compiled his writings into a book with over 800 pages of text. The second book of interviews is equally long. In a September 2019 article for Artsy, Alina Cohen described Judd as one of art history's greatest contrarians. She stated that Judd was ready to argue about anything. Now, while best known for his three-dimensional artworks, Donald Judd started with painting in the late 40s and continued painting and working in various genres of painting until the early 60s. Shown here are two works, one from 1958 and one from 1960, both painted during his abstract period. He was well acquainted with the work of Jackson Pollock and Barnett Newman, for example, as well as Mark Rothko, Piet Mondrian. As he developed as an artist, he became more aware of Russian artists, including Vasily Kandinsky, Kazimir Malevich, and Vladimir Tatlin. He found Mondrian to be quite influential, but less easily understood than the others. Of most interest to Judd were the Suprematist movement, headed by Malevich, and the Constructivist movement, headed by Tatlin. In a 1981 essay titled Russian Art in Regard to Myself, Judd states, "Of those who began the non-objective trend, Malevich was the most clear in his painting and writing, as was Mondrian. I knew that I didn't understand Mondrian enough to use his work, if you should use someone's work. The period in Russia before and with Malevich was amazing. Shown here are two early works by Kazimir Malevich, The Black Square and The Black Circle. Now, this fascination with Russian art, as well as architecture, would stay with Judd his entire life. He collected and studied books throughout his career, amassing a very sizable library, shown here at The Block in Marfa, Texas. Included in the collection were over 24 books on Russian art, some of which he reportedly read more than once. In addition to his reading about Russia, he traveled to Russia on 4 occasions, the first trip occurring in 1987, accompanied by his 2 children, Flavin and Rainer. While there, he toured various cities studying Russian architecture and art. And finally, in 1990, Judd was one of the first Western artists to exhibit his works in Russia. His only exhibition in Russia opened in August at the Soviet Cultural Federation in Moscow. Little is known about the exhibition, as there were only a few surviving documents describing it. Now, Kazimir Malevich transitioned to creating 3D objects as the Suprematist movement in painting was coming to a conclusion in 1918. In the 20s, Malevich transitioned to 3-dimensional objects, many of them architectural in nature. Shown here is an example of one of his architectonics. During this period, Malevich virtually gave up all painting, choosing to concentrate on writing and 3-dimensional art. Now, this transition is shown here as the Malevich influence became more relevant as Judd's career progressed. In the early 1960s, Donald Judd began a transition from painting to 3-dimensional art, much like Malevich. The transition seemed to evolve as he tried to identify what he should do next. He felt that he was never going to be an exceptional painter, yet he did want to explore the idea of extending the paintings of Pollock and Rothko to 3-dimensional art. In an essay titled Specific Objects, commissioned and written in 1964, and first published in Arts Yearbook number 8, 1 year later in 1965, Judd stated, "Half or more of the best new work in the last few years has been neither painting nor sculpture. Usually it has been related closely or distantly to one or the other." But he goes on to state that the new three-dimensional work doesn't constitute a movement, school, or style. The disinterest in painting and sculpture is a disinterest in doing it again. Specific objects are the best work, utterly obvious in their materials and construction, and not referring to or representing anything but themselves. Now, in 1965, the term minimal art was coined by an English philosopher named Richard Wollheim in an essay for Arts Magazine. And he wasn't describing a movement, but was describing the minimal content of new trends developing in art at the time. The term has since become the accepted name for a movement, including artists such as Judd, Dan Flavin, Carl Andre, Saul LeWitt, Robert Morris, and more. Judd, however, along with the others, would continue to reject inclusion of their work in the so-called minimal art movement. Recalling that Judd discussed this new work as not being a movement, school, or style, he supports this belief by stating that the common aspects are too general and too little common to define a movement. The differences are greater than the similarities. As seen here is one of Judd's first specific objects created from wood. And these early works were built by Donald Judd, often with the help of his father. Note the use of the color red. This was very common in Judd's early work. Now, shown here is one of Judd's many progressions. This one consisting of aluminum and brass. And if you look at the brass-colored sections, starting from the right, notice the first block has a particular size. The next block is exactly twice that size. The third block is the width of the first two combined, and the next block the width of blocks 2 and 3 combined. This progression is known as the Fibonacci Sequence. So now, look at the spaces between the brass-colored blocks, starting from the left. The spaces follow the same sequence and are the same size as the brass blocks. This progression is a very carefully designed, specific object of planned and precise dimensions. The use of space is of equal importance in the object as the metal blocks. Judd wrote of space, "I became uneasy with the indefinite space of Mondrian's paintings." And Roberta Smith, in a New York Times article in 2013, wrote the following about Judd and the use of space. She states, he made simple geometric forms that used more space than materials. Space, after all, was his ultimate material. Now, early in Judd's transition to three-dimensional objects, he began utilizing tradesmen and fabricators to build the actual objects, or at least when he could afford it. In a 1965 interview conducted by Bruce Houghton for the Smithsonian Institution, Judd stated, "I pay a lot of attention to how things are done, and the whole act of building something is interesting." But then he goes on to say that building things can be really boring too. After all, the work isn't the point, the piece is. So part of the motivation for the use of outside professional fabricators was Judd's desire for precision, which he would admit he struggled with when he personally completed the objects. Another practical consideration was a fabricator's capacity to make more objects than Judd could. Well, the use of fabricators led to the inevitable problem of authentication of his work, which was common to all the minimalists. Judd would issue certificates, as did his friends Flavin and Lewitt, for example. Donald Judd is seen here at Bernstein Brothers in Long Island City, New York. Bernstein was an HVAC fabricator able to complete the requirements of Judd's objects. Judd used Bernstein for a number of his works, including the stacks. He would provide the drawings, specifications for materials, color, size, etc., and then they would execute the objects. Another fabricator was the Lippincott Company in Connecticut. For example, they created the famous 100 Untitled works in mill aluminum. And in that case, the mill aluminum was specially rolled by Kaiser Aluminum just for Judd's objects. Now, the modern stack, as described by Frances Colpett in the museum catalog, is a classic example of minimalism. She goes on to say, Untitled is characterized by a clarity of materials and form, the result of the artist's consideration of space, color, and scale. It also declares an emphatic unity as a single object, even though it is made from 10 discrete, identical boxes placed one above the other. Let's consider each of these aspects of the work: space, unity, color, scale, and repetition of identical components. Now, as we've already discussed, Judd was very interested in space in a work as something that he should be independently considering as it relates to the whole. In his words, what is needed is a created space, space made by someone, space that is formed as is a solid, the two the same, with the space and the solid defining each other. Now, in this case, a quick calculation of the dimensions of the boxes as compared to the overall dimension of the stack reveals that the boxes and spaces are exactly the same size. Further, recalling Colpett's earlier statement that the work as a whole towers above the visitor suggests the careful integration of identical boxes and spaces combining to form a much larger whole. Said another way, they are unified. And regarding color, Judd typically used no more than 2 colors in his works prior to the 1980s. As we see here, there are only the natural color of the stainless steel frame and the reddish-orange of the plexiglass top and bottom panels. And Judd was actually considered a colorist and used color combinations to provide variance in his specific objects. Judd did believe that color was non-referential. So in other words, dark colors, for example, don't suggest a mood any more than bright colors. And looking at the overall scale of the work, it is useful to remember Judd's interest in engineering and architecture. He looked at material and space and then considered the art, the site, and the observer. It is appropriate here to quote one of Judd's contemporaries, Carl Andre. And Andre stated, "I'm not a studio artist, I'm a location artist." So the scale of this stack is such that it nicely fits the gallery, yet, when viewed in closer proximity, it can simultaneously seem a bit intimidating. And finally, the whole can be seen as a repetition of individual objects. As Frances Colpett states, it is made from 10 discrete, identical boxes placed one above the other. And this duality of repetition and the whole is accomplished in part by Judd's requirement of simplicity and precision of fabrication by his chosen fabricators. The precision of construction combined with precision of installation, produces the effect of a repetitive yet whole object. Judd himself described the repetition of the stacks as one thing after another. This precision of installation is a trademark of Judd and is perhaps best displayed with the 100 Untitled works in mill aluminum at the Judd Foundation in Marfa, Texas. These works are aligned using lasers and must be periodically corrected as they shift small fractions of an inch due to contraction and expansion from temperature fluctuations. He was very aware of the installation of his works and demanded absolute precision. While the stacks and other specific objects are no longer produced, Donald Judd designed furniture is still available for purchase in linseed oiled wood and in brightly colored powder-coated metal form. The Judd Foundation is the source for both. During his lifetime, Donald Judd used a fabricator in Dubendorf, Switzerland to build brightly colored artworks, including furniture. The same company still constructs Judd design pieces today. And Donald Judd actually had an ongoing relationship with Switzerland, owning a house in Switzerland later in his career. Closer to home, Donald Judd left a wonderful art treasure at the Judd Foundation. Originally developed for Judd, Dan Flavin, and John Chamberlain, the Judd Foundation has become a site for many other artists such as Ronnie Horn, Robert Irwin, Ilya Kabakov, Carl Andre, Richard Long, and many more. And it is well worth the trek to Marfa. The Judd Foundation has a significant presence in Marfa, as well as at the renovated first home of Judd at 101 Spring Street in Soho, Manhattan. Thank you for spending time with us today, and we look forward to sharing with you the next installment of Slow Art presented by the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth.